welcome everybody. Thanks for coming to the library this afternoon for this presentation on The American Way by Helene Stapinski and Bonnie Siegler. My name is Sandy Carlson and I'll be moderating this conversation. Helene is a nationally best-selling author of 3 memoirs, Five Finger Discount, Murder in Matera, and Baby Plays Around. She writes regularly for the New York Times, and her work has appeared in the Washington Post, New York Magazine, and dozens of other publications. She teaches at NYU and lives in Brooklyn. Google Helene's name and you will find interesting things to read all day. For a year. Same with Bonnie. When you search up Bonnie, you're going to find some incredible design work. Bonnie is the founder and creative director of the award-winning multidisciplinary graphic design studio 8½. She's the author of Dear Client, a guide for people who work with creatives, and Signs of Resistance, a visual history of protest in America. She's also taught design in the graduate schools of Yale University and the School of Visual Arts for many years. She lives in Connecticut, so we get to take credit. The American Way is a work of nonfiction that reads like America's memoir of the 20th century, depicting the interplay of pop culture, Hollywood, pulp fiction, comics, and superheroes with immigration, Nazism, and the Holocaust. The American Way weaves the stories of Jews who fled to the U.S. from Europe to keep their families alive, and how they reinvented themselves to find happiness and success and become part of the American way in an America that didn't hand them anything. It's an amazing story. So welcome to the Library Gallery for this conversation. It's just awesome to have so many people here on this beautiful day. And thought I'd ask if you would read from the first chapter of the book so that our audience can get a sense of the sweep and scope of the story that the American Way tells.
I'll read the first half and Helene will read.
Yeah, but I'll read at the end.
Oh, okay.
Right back. Because they kind of dovetail at the beginning and end.
Okay, I'm reading the prologue. The 10-block walk, New York City, 1954. Jules Schulbach, that's my grandfather, by the way, left his 3rd-floor apartment around midnight and stepped onto the sidewalk at Lexington and 61st Street in Manhattan, carrying what looked like a black lunchbox with chrome around the edges. He surveyed the familiar view, glancing at an upstairs window across the street that belonged strangely to a doll hospital. Its lights and red neon crosses had been turned off for the evening, hiding the buckets of miniature heads and arms and various doll parts that would spook visitors when they peeked from his apartment window in the daylight. But Jules found the doll hospital mildly amusing, as he did most things. He panned his gaze a few doors down and crossed the avenue to his fur shop. Its treasures were locked up for the night. Jules inspected the darkened window, as he always did when passing by, partly to admire his display, frozen mannequins posed in the latest minks and fox stoles, but also to check that everything was all right in his absence, and it was. Since it was a Tuesday night, the streets of Manhattan were mostly deserted. Jules's shadow, one of the only ones cast by dim streetlights, and a moon that was just past full. The Chrysler Building loomed in the distance, only a few of its offices lit, the bright moons reflecting off the spiked metal helmet of its tower. The temperature was in the 50s, chilly for early fall. In Jules's version of the story, a story he would retell again and again over the decades, a few checker cabs flew by, a few crawled, looking for a fare, but Jules walked. 2 blocks, then 3, past shuttered drugstores and dry cleaners, past silent newsstands and grocery stores, past a single bored cop on the beat, to whom he gave a respectful nod but didn't stop to chat up. Jules loved to chat and loved to spin a good story, but tonight he was a man with a mission, not just an insomniac out on a late-night stroll in the greatest city in the world. He did not have an American dream. He was already living it, right now, right here on those streets. As he drew closer to his destination, East 51st Street, Jules sensed a strange charge in the atmosphere, as if the molecules were being rearranged somehow, and a distant hum, even before he saw the crowd. He passed the all-night coffee shop with its pink neon and the onion-shaped green copper domes of Central Synagogue on the corner of 55th Street, so much like the one he had left behind in Berlin. And sure enough, 3 blocks away he could see it, a bright glow up ahead. As he drew nearer, the lights were brighter than daylight, the crowd deeper than those on the 42nd Street subway platform during rush hour. His heart beating faster with each step, Jules realized there was something strange about this crowd. He couldn't identify it right away. It took a few beats, but then it hit him. There were only men here. their families and wives tucked safely into bed in their apartments. Like Yankee Stadium under the floodlights, men in hats and jackets and a smattering of ties stood around, excited for the games to begin. Some stood on fire escapes and the roofs of cars, perched on lampposts and atop traffic lights, all trying to find a good spot to glimpse the coming attraction, the American dream made flesh, with all its promises and curves. One of the Yankees was even here, Joe DiMaggio, shaking hands and working the growing crowd of photographers, cops, loiterers, and fans. Jules dove right in. He'd never been a timid man. If he had been, he wouldn't be here walking the earth. Gently pushing his way through the crowd, using his free hand and a few German-accented pardon me's and excuse me's, he was a gentleman after all, he got as close as he could to the commotion. There was the gaffer he had met yesterday who tipped him off about tonight. They nodded in recognition. Then the movie director flitted past in his fedora, nervously eyeing the growing throng. His name was Billy Wilder. They were both from Berlin, Jules knew, both escaped Jewish refugees. He caught Wilder's eye and held it for a moment, long enough to think that maybe Billy, too, knew what they had in common, as if Jules was marked somehow with invisible ink that only the fellow wounded could detect. Billy walked past, and Jules was suddenly reminded of his purpose here tonight. He squeezed his black box between his legs, screwed around with a few knobs, wound a small crank, knelt down in a free space between bodies, and then placed the box up to his right eye, his Bolex 16mm camera. It was September 15th, 1954, and it was no accident he was here. Jules was a thoughtful man who had always planned everything very carefully. Befriending that gaffer was just one of many steps that brought this furrier and amateur filmmaker to the front row of one of the most iconic moments in 20th century film history, one that he, and he alone, would save for posterity in living, moving color. Jules looked around the artificially lit New York City street corner, always so much life, so much to capture. He had tasted the bitterness of life, but this was the sweet part. He peeked through the lens of his Bolex, focused on Billy Wilder and the crew in front of him. And suddenly, as if she knew he was coming, out stepped Marilyn Monroe. And action.
You're on.
Thanks, Bonnie. So there you go, the very beginning of an incredible book. So this, like you said, is your grandfather, Jules Schulbeck's story. What's it like to have his story presented to the world as this epic, sweeping journey?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, we called my grandparents Omi and Opie. I thought those were their official names my whole life. And even Helene will mention Jules to me. Who's Jules? Like, it just doesn't sink in. But I'm so proud of him. I mean, he's the hero in my family, he's the hero in my life, and we all need more heroes. So it's kind of an honor to tell his story, and also it's just important for us to keep telling these stories over and over and over. That's what we learn from history, that's how we avoid making the same mistakes again. So it's really an honor to be able to do it.
That's amazing. So, Helene, you didn't know Opie.
I did not.
And you do now.
Thank you. That's so sweet of you.
And yet you created this incredible, detailed portrait of somebody we all want to know by the time we dig into this book. This is the grandpa, this is the uncle.
Right.
What was it like? Was there any sense of pressure? What was it like to create a human being with words?
Well, you know, I had met Bonnie years ago. I guess it was back in 2016?
16.
Yeah, 16. I had done a story about her grandfather. She had kind of sought me out and found me to write the story about her grandfather. She had found the footage of Marilyn Monroe that he shot that night, which you're going to hear more of later. And so that was sort of the beginning of the genesis, those are the right word, the genesis of the project. She found me, she wanted me to write about it for a newspaper, for the Times. I write for the Times regularly. So I met with Bonnie, and she showed me the footage of Marilyn Monroe from that night that her grandfather shot, which is incredible. It's like, you're Marilyn Monroe and I'm her grandfather. That's how close, probably closer. And it's very beautiful footage, very crystal clear. And it's the last surviving footage from that night, because Billy Wilder was shooting on the street, but it was too noisy because of all the guys standing around yelling and shouting things at Marilyn Monroe. So they reshot it on a soundstage in Hollywood. So his footage was the last remaining footage. She finds the footage years ago, right? Comes to me, wants me to write a story about her grandfather, not just the footage, but him escaping from Nazi Germany. So I meet with Bonnie.
That's really the story I wanted told, was his escape, but I had a pretty girl to put at the front of the story.
Right. So
A really pretty girl.
Everybody wants to know about Marilyn Monroe, right? So that was the hook for me. You know, I saw that footage, but then when I heard his story from Bonnie and all the tales that he told her about escaping Berlin, I was like, oh my God, this is an amazing story. So I did pitch it to the Times, and it became one of those viral hits in the Times. It went around the world and back again. A lot of people read it. And then a few years later, after we'd already become friends, Bonnie came to me and said, do you want to write a book about my grandfather? And this was right before the pandemic. We didn't know we were going to be in isolation for 2 years, but thankfully I said yes. And Bonnie did the bulk of the research on the book, and then she would just shovel information to me, and I would write the story. And to answer your question, I mean, I kind of felt like I sort of knew Jules, or Opie, when I first talked to Bonnie, because she was so enthusiastic about him and knew his stories, and so I was getting to know him. But then once we started researching the book, I mean, I do feel like I knew him. You know, I mean, I wish he was here to do this presentation with us, because he sounds like he was an awesome guy. And I had a pretty bad grandfather. He tried to kill us when I was a kid, but that's a whole other book. But so he's sort of my stand-in grandpa, I think, my stand-in Opie, you know. And I guess I've been looking for a good grandfather for a long time, and I found him through Bonnie. And so it was just a thrill to bring him to life and to make him this hero that he was, and to let you guys learn about him. So.
Yeah, that image in the prologue of him making his way right up to within feet of the starlet, I think captures a lot of his personality. An amazing thing about this book is how it's structured. There are the notes in the back. Any book nerds among us? Oh, come on, guys. Yeah.
Librarian.
Yeah, right. The notes in the back are incredible. They're written in a narrative style that also lets you go find them if you're inclined. So it's very nice to read a chapter where you feel like you're in the Romanish's cafe. It's so vividly detailed, and you're thinking, how did they do that? You know, and you go back to the notes, and how did they capture the buildings where these people lived, where Jules and his family and Edith and the family lived. And you find out they went there. So can you tell us about what it was like to go back to Berlin and be in the buildings where your family had lived, the buildings from which they fled to find safety here?
It was completely surreal. Also, I just want to say a friend of mine just texted me and said, my dad read the book, he loved it. He spot checked a few things, and they all checked out.
So we're clear.
What a relief! But now I need to know what he spot checked. So I just love the idea. He went to the notes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It was really surreal going to Berlin. I mean, my associations with Germany are really the sound of feet on the pebbles in camps. You know, when people tour camps and it's silent except for the. That was. So I didn't want to go, really, like in my heart I didn't ever want to go, but we had to go, and I had to see it for myself. And we also brought my son, who was 15 at the time, so that was very special, because when I had my first child, my grandfather got to know my first son, and he said, you have to have another, and we did. And that's this one, who I brought to Berlin with me. So that was really special.
You're a very well-behaved person, actually.
It was terrible. I was guilt-ridden. But you know, Germany was completely bombed and destroyed, but all of my ancestors' homes were still there. Every store, every apartment building, which is weird because it'll be an old building between two brand new buildings. Yeah. Why did this one remain? So, and we got to go inside all the buildings, and just, it was incredible. And I could feel them. I really could.
It was great. And she really pushed to go. I was sort of like, the book was almost done, actually, because of the pandemic. We couldn't go to Berlin. So it wasn't until the end of the creation of the book that it opened up. And she was like, we still have to go. We just have to go. And so then, you know, everything we found got stuck into the book where it was already written, but amped up, you know, so you could actually see those places, you know. And then Berlin all kind of came together for me in my head, because I looked at maps, but when you go, it's a whole different experience, right? And one of the places we went was the Wannsee House, which is where the Nazis met to come up with the final solution. And Wannsee was a lake where her grandfather used to go when he was in his 20s, before the Nazis came to power. And And so to go to that villa and to see where he sunbathed right across the way, and it was just really amazing, amazing stuff.
Because it was yesterday.
And
you know, I mean,
long ago.
it really was. Time is a funny thing, and when you're standing in a place where something happened, you can feel it. You really can.
It was amazing.
And what's also interesting about that, when you talk about the young Billy Wilder with coins in his pocket, trying to figure out what he's going to do, reading the newspaper and ordering the cheapest thing on the menu, a soft-boiled egg, but free and welcome to spend as much time as he wanted to over that egg reading the newspaper.
Right.
And your grandparents on the lake as young people and admiring the beauty of it and the welcome. What's stunning and chilling is how quickly Berlin flipped.
Right.
It's both quickly and slowly, because it started in 33. The 400 laws that made it so Jews couldn't do anything or sit anywhere or own a business or own property, those started in 35. 400 laws between 35 and 41. I mean, it's insane, all about what Jews couldn't do. So it was both incredibly fast and incredibly slow, because it was like that frog in the pot of boiling. People, a lot of people were like, okay, now we know what the laws are, so we're fine, because there are rules and they're written down. They can't just beat us up because there are rules. But they weren't fine. Of course they weren't fine, but it
just got progressively worse, yeah. And I think people felt like they could wait it out. You know, Hitler's not that bad. You know, he'll get voted out or whatever. It's not going to be that bad. We'll just wait it out. And of course it got worse and worse. And if you didn't get out by a certain time, you couldn't get out. You know, and that's what happened to her great-grandparents. They never got out. So I don't remember what that question was, but
That was the answer to it. I guess this kind of comes back to my previous question about the writing process for you, Helene, but as this is a departure from writing memoir in terms of it. Could you just speak to the writing process for you? Was this in some way similar to writing your memoirs, having gotten to know Bonnie so well, or was it a departure for you?
it was a little different, obviously. It wasn't me, right? The 3 books that I wrote before this were about me and my family. So this was, I basically ran out of material, you know. I ran out of stories. And so I had to go somewhere else to find some stories, and Bonnie's family stepped right in, just coincidentally. And so it was the same kind of process, except instead of interviewing my relatives, I was interviewing Bonnie's relatives. You know what I mean? She would set up a different interview every day. You know, she was on all the calls with me. And these were relatives she didn't even know, some of them. You know, they were just, she tracked them down and got them on the Zoom call. And so
we basically just asked them for stories, any memories that they had, and everybody was really happy to share their memories. Even people who were like, who are you again? Like, they didn't know me, but I knew them through the family tree. So it was a really great way to enlarge my family, too.
Right. So I kind of got adopted by her family, and so, you know, we talked to her mother about 1,000 times. And one story, which we're still talking about, we talked about in the car today, you know, we knew that her grandfather had escaped from Nazi Germany the day before Kristallnacht, okay? And for us writing the book, we're like, wow, what a coincidence. Like, he left right before Kristallnacht. That's amazing. Thank God he got out when he did, because after that it was really hard to get out. And one day we're talking to her mom about something completely different, and your dad, right, it was your dad actually, and he said, well, yeah, I think it was because of that Gestapo guy who lived in Jules's building told him he needed to leave that day. I'm like, what? You know, we never heard that story before, you know. And so you just get these little bits and pieces, and I guess her family assumed she knew that story, but she never heard that story. And so the Gestapo guy becomes part of the narrative, you know, that guy who lived in their building who really saved their life.
And it also points to the anti-Semitism. In Germany, Jews as a group were hated, but individual people weren't necessarily hated. So that guy was okay, and he'd save his life and tell him to leave Germany, but all the rest, no, it didn't matter.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a crazy psychological portrait.
Yeah.
Bonnie, you mentioned that people were willing to talk and tell the story even if they couldn't quite connect you with the family tree, find your branch. Is this the time for this story? Has enough time passed between the experience of the events and initial memories that people are a little bit more forthcoming now than maybe at a previous time?
Absolutely. And more Shoah testimony tapes where people go in and record have been done in the last 10 years than in all the previous years, because people get older and think, I have to just do this. It's time, I have to do it, which happened with lots of my relatives, and those who had passed, we watched their show tapes, which can be 2 hours long of just them telling their detailed experience. So some of the people, they told us their story, even though they're no longer with us, they told us their story, which was incredible.
And how did you get access to the show of stories?
You have to just go, it's all online.
Just Google?
It's basically Google.
Yeah,
You
I
can
find it. You can
that's-
find anything.
There are different organizations that do it. There's Fortune Off at Yale and the Shoah at USC, and depending on where people live, they do it in different places, but it's findable.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
And you have to be a relative or have some connection to the person, like you can't just go on and watch anybody's. You have to say, you don't need proof, you have to say you're a relative.
Right. But there are ones that are also available as well. Like when I was trying to recreate the lives of the people who didn't get out. So all his relatives, all of Jules' relatives and his wife's relatives. So one relative, for instance, went to 4 concentration camps. Okay, 4 concentration camps.
And survived.
Yeah. And so she's no longer with us. She died in her 70s or so. She was, beaten down, obviously, by what happened to her. But so we had a little bit of information from her son, who we interviewed, but we didn't know that much about what happened to her. And so I basically went to one of the Holocaust museums.
Yeah.
Was it that? I don't even remember. And found interviews with people who were in the concentration camps she was in at the exact same time to see what was going on there. So to try and recreate what that looked like and what that sounded like and what they were doing to people there. So you can find, there's definitely stuff out there if you're interested. It's all out there.
Yeah, at the Holocaust Museum,
Yeah.
they have a bunch of
Yeah.
selected ones, too.
Yeah.
So the thing that only you could find, Bonnie, was that video. Right?
Yes.
The film, not video, the film footage.
Yes.
The film footage of Marilyn Monroe. Could you just tell our group what was that discovery like, having heard the stories of the video from your grandpa all the time?
Yeah. So my grandfather, as you'll learn if you read the book, was evicted from his apartment when he was 93 years old.
Oh my goodness.
I know. A foundation bought the townhouse he lived in and evicted all the tenants. It was crazy. And long story, but anyway, it's in there. So we had to move him. We had to pack him up and move him across the park. And while I went into, thank you for writing the pelt room, so he was a furrier still, and he had a room with all the old furs hanging in it and lots of crap, just like a real mess. And we were cleaning that out and packing it up, and there was a D'Agostino, is a grocery store in the city, there was a D'Agostino's bag that looked like it had garbage in it. And I opened it up, and it was just filled with 16mm film, all loose.
Off the reel.
Off the reel. So, and my husband is a filmmaker, so I brought it home and we put it on the reel-to-reel and instantly could see it was the film because she's wearing a white dress on a dark background. So you could just see it in that little tiny frame. It's like the closest thing to finding buried treasure, I imagine. Like it was so, we'd heard the story for so long. I never doubted it, but I didn't know if I'd ever see it, which is 2 different things. So it was really thrilling, and of course I called my grandfather and I said, Opie, we found the Marilyn film. And he said, of course you did. It had only been, 40 years since he'd seen it, but of course you did.
Yeah, nothing like the old family closet.
That's true.
They seem to go on forever, right?
Led it to be off-reel and stuffed in a bag.
He just had a lot of film. He's had like thousands of reels of film.
But even at the time.
I know, it could have been my aunt had done that, I don't know. Somebody might have said, she thought Marilyn was, whatever, fill in the blank.
I'm glad she didn't throw it away.
I know, she could have thrown it away. I mean, we were lucky. Yeah.
Was he on the production crew? How did he get the film?
No. He had a 16mm Bolex, and he was standing. You can see in the film the camera lights and those the gates on the lights. Like he's standing right behind Billy Wilder, who crosses in front of him.
Yeah. He
So
just lived in
Marilyn-
the neighborhood. He just.
Yes, he's I don't know if you remember the terrible movie that is The 7-Year Itch, but it starts in a townhouse, which was actually across the street from his apartment, and the movie theater was down the street. So that's how he found out about the movie theater shoot, and he just went out at 1 a.m. with his 16mm Bolex. He had Kodachrome film in it, if any of you know what that means, and there were movie lights, so it was lit really well.
Beautifully lit.
Because usually when people shoot home movies, the lighting is the problem, but he had movie lights.
And then, so did he give that film to Billy Wilder?
No, he just went home with it.
Oh, he just went home, so
Yeah.
nobody knew about it.
Nobody knew about
She
it.
found it.
Billy Wilder was shooting it
She
himself.
found it in a bag.
And then Billy Wilder, because I don't know if you guys know, but that night, Joe DiMaggio was Marilyn's husband. He was devastated by what he saw, her skirt going up over her head, all the men screaming at her, and that night he took his anger out on her, and she left him the next day.
Wow.
And Billy Wilder ended up reshooting that scene in The 7-Year Itch. The one that's in the movie was shot in LA on a soundstage, because he couldn't use the footage that we have. And my footage has no sound, right? It's just straight up home movie, 16 millimeter.
And you can find it online, actually. If you Google our names, or one of our names, and Marilyn Monroe in the New York Times, you'll see the footage. It's a little clip of footage.
Yeah, it's called The Lost Footage of Marilyn Monroe.
That's the name of the story.
That was what the time, that was the big headline, but it was really about Opie.
Right. It's more about the Nazis.
So the book is full of these incredible stories of names we're familiar with, of people who have survived, and Marilyn Monroe was also a survivor in her own right. And I just have to say, I mean, she's so respectfully treated in this text. It is a treat in itself.
We love her.
Yeah, it's amazing. And there are other survivors whose names might be brand new. Uschi Friedman, somebody who was a U-boat, right?
Yep.
She survived Nazi Berlin in plain sight. She has the red hair and freckles?
Yes.
And she had a typewriter. I mean, there are superheroes in here, but a superhero who's lugging a typewriter around Berlin.
And to America.
And to America. Is it still around?
I think Audrey said she doesn't have it.
I think
No.
he has them.
It would be
I would have
German.
I would have had to see it. If
Yeah,
they had it,
I
so
know.
I don't think they have it. I think it got lost in the shuffle.
But she did schlep it from hiding place to hiding place to hiding place. And it was against the law to have a typewriter, just like it was against the law to have a radio.
If you were Jewish.
If you were Jewish, sorry. I thought that went without saying.
So, but virtue of the fact that she had a typewriter, she must not be Jewish, right? If she's
Right.
carrying this across town,
But if she was caught, she would be caught.
she would be caught. Could you just relate the anecdote of how she visits her friend who isn't Jewish in the prison?
Leah.
With
Leah was Jewish.
Oh,
Yeah,
she was Jewish.
Yeah.
And she had the bottle of.
She gave her
Cognac.
a bottle
Cognac.
of cognac, which Leah then was on a transport train to camps. She bribed a guard on the train with this bottle of cognac to let her go to the bathroom in another car instead of in the bucket. And she jumped out the window of the moving train and escaped, came to America, and my grandparents made her wedding for her.
So her aunt Uschi was the one who gave her the cognac to let her escape. If she didn't have that bottle of cognac, she made it.
And you can remember, it's Uschi like Tushy, because
Okay, Uschi.
she's
Uschi.
my aunt, so we
Okay.
called her Aunt Tushy.
So Helene, did in the writing process, did you develop an affection for any of the minor characters in the
Uschi.
story? Uschi?
I really loved Uschi. We didn't even know we were going to be writing about Uschi. She had another aunt who had died in Paris. She had worked for an orphanage, getting kids out of Nazi France at the time, and who was murdered. And we wanted to write her story as part of the story, but we couldn't find anything about her. And so we sort of changed gears at the last minute, and we realized that Uschi was this amazing character. So we started to dig into that character, and she's just one of my favorites. She was very young at the time. She was in her early 20s, and she they called them U-boats or submarines, people who were Jewish who were living in Berlin at the time or anywhere.
Underground.
Underground, yeah, U-boats. And so she survived all those years during the war, going from place to place, avoiding Nazi capture, and finally came to America.
And then after the war, she got on a boat, because she was in a displaced persons camp for a while, got on a boat to come to America and met her husband
On the boat.
on the boat. He had hid out for the whole war as well.
Yeah, they had a lot in common. Yeah, she was definitely one of my favorite characters.
Why this book is a treasure, right? And what this book also captures is how first generation Jews who would come to America really became integral parts of American pop culture in the movie industry and the comic book industry. And the comic book industry had a direct connection to Jules's families, him with his wife and his daughter, getting to this, getting to across the Atlantic, to get to America.
Should we explain that?
Would you, yeah, would you, yeah, it's an amazing story, and just how the comic book creators create a solution
Right.
to the Hitler situation. If you would explain
Sure.
that would be great.
So basically, the comic book industry was started by lots of Jewish people because they weren't allowed into the regular literary publishing world, right? So they started the comic book industry. And one of the main guys who started the comic book industry was Harry Donenfeld. And he published something called DC Comics, which you're all familiar with now. And DC Comics' first hero was Superman. And so there he is. So Harry lived next door to Jules's cousin in the Bronx.
In the early 30s.
And so they had stayed friends over the years. Harry went on to fame and fortune with all kinds of stuff. He was a bootlegger and did all kinds of interesting things. Before Superman was even released, Jules comes to New York looking for a sponsor because you needed a financial sponsor to come to America if you were trying to get out of Nazi Germany. You needed someone to vouch for you and say you wouldn't be a burden on the state, similar to today. If you're an immigrant coming to America, you have to have someone vouch for you. And so Faye, the cousin, got Harry to vouch for Jules. So Harry, who published Superman, became the savior for Bonnie's family. And if it wasn't for Harry Donenfeld, Bonnie wouldn't be sitting in this chair right now.
And there are a total of 22 of us who are here only because Harry Donenfeld signed those papers.
And so we talked to Harry's family. Harry's no longer with us, but we spoke to his grandkids, and you know, we got great information from them to fill in the blanks about who he was. And so he's a major character. He and Jules are kind of the main characters, actually. Many of the chapters kind of go back and forth between them until they meet, right? And then you find out what happens to Harry, too. We don't want to give it all away.
No. And so are Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who actually were two Jewish boys who created Superman in Cleveland. And most people know the original story that when Harry bought the Superman comic from Jerry and Joe, who were these two really eager kids who had worked for 5 years to sell this Superman comic. They knew it was a great idea. He paid them $130 and got all the rights.
Wow.
For the rest of their lives. They fought to get them back. So that's the other side of Harry.
Yeah, Harry's a complicated character. So.
Harry represents both sides of the American way, the good side and the bad side.
And I think that part of the power of the story is that there are no apologies for anybody. They're all well-rounded, well-developed, researched human beings who had to make difficult choices to survive, and not always ethical choices, unfortunately. And just to bring Harry back from the edge, what of not being a very likable character, what he did indeed found organizations, didn't he, to help bring.
He donated.
He donated money.
Yeah,
okay.
he created a foundation in like '44 and donated just to Jewish causes. Really weird stuff like the Sophie Tucker Playground. I don't know, things like that, camps and different local Jewish organizations. He gave a lot of money to. And as soon as he started earning real money, that's what he set up. And they continue to. His grandchildren
they're still running
keep doing it.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I'm thinking about some things that I read recently about one of Jodi Picoult's novels being removed from shelves in Florida for daring to depict the Holocaust and people not wanting to be a part of that, and news stories about neo-Nazis in this country adopting the emblems and gestures and slogans of Nazis. And it takes me back to the book and to the Berlin where these things were, this kind of behavior was normalized and codified. So now there are parameters because we're thinking in terms of that. In your writing of this book during these times in our country, do you see any analogs or cause for concern?
Do you want to go with that one?
I'm sorry. Yes. That's the whole reason we wrote it. It's gotten so bad, it's ridiculous. It started with Trump saying there are good people on both sides, and it's just gotten worse since then. But you could see it then. That's the beginning. That's how it starts. It's okay to say something horrible and hateful. Oh, it's okay. He said it. Now I can say it. Now I can say it. Now I can say it. And it's just been this horrible. Since then, it's just gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. They just had a day of hate in California.
I think that was nationwide. Was it just?
I thought it was.
I thought it was nationwide.
That's right, and I think that's part of the value of this book and the fact of the book being checked and validated in real time. I think that whenever we are presenting an argument or an idea or a point of view, that researching it and understanding where it comes from, but also developing an understanding of where people who might disagree with us are coming from. I think that's how we build empathy, and I think the power of this novel, or not, see, it's not a novel, it reads like a novel. The power of this incredible work of nonfiction is the humanity it brings to people that we might be tempted to write off if we just read a news story about Harry ripping off Superman's creator.
No, exactly. I mean, most people know Anne Frank is a little bit of a celebrity, right? All the kids know Anne Frank, okay? So she doesn't really count. She's not a real person now, and they know 6 million, and nothing in between. So here are some of the people in between. Regular people living their lives totally innocent who got caught up in it. And it changes the way you see the story when you don't see it abstractly, a country, but a person. And that's how you develop empathy for that side.
It is, and I think, you know, in the 45 minutes that we've been talking, we have touched on many of the players in this story, but the cast of characters is vast. And
here's the list.
Yeah, Joe DiMaggio, Clark Gable, Arthur Miller, Frank Costello, Albert Einstein, Hugh Hefner, Howard Hughes, well, nobody escapes, Walter Winchell, Jesse Owens, Jack Dempsey. I did not know he owned hotels.
Yes.
And Bess Meyerson, Fritz Lang, Margaret Sanger, Charlie Chaplin, Marlene Dietrich, and many more. And I got to tell you, this is a tour de force, this book. And what these people here with me did for us is they gave us the cast of characters with the families, for the most part, and then you have this incredible set of notes in the back to guide you through, and it is an amazing reading journey. It is such an accessible book. When I wrote a review, I said I read it in 2 days. My friend Alice did the same thing. Couldn't put it down, wasn't about to, because it was so captivating, because those people were so real, because it took us to a place and a time that is hard to go to, Nazi Germany. Isolationist America, where things are not telling, it's not the narrative we like to remember about our country, but there are tough times, right? And it lets us live in that time and see it for what it was and see human beings for who they are. And ultimately, this story has a happy ending. It will make you cry, that's my bet. And
it is uplifting.
And it is.
Read the end? Are you done?
Well, why don't you fact check me and read from the end?
Okay.
I want you to come with us wherever we go and talk up the book.
I'm going to read from near the end of the book. So this is, now we've gone through Jules' whole journey, right? We've seen what's happened to the family, we see what's happened to Harry, we see what's happened to Marilyn Monroe, and now Bonnie has found the film, okay? So this is going back to where we were at the beginning. And suddenly, there she is again, Marilyn, her full body in view from 5 feet away. It's the shot we've all been waiting for, the shot seen round the world, not in still, but in moving, living, luxuriously saturated Kodachrome, the lost footage of one of the most iconic moments in American film history. For a minute and a half, Marilyn moves and breathes and is alive again, not on television or up on a wide screen, but in a home movie that hardly anyone has ever seen. The American Dream in Flesh and Blood. She holds a red and white striped scarf in one hand and a white clutch in the other and tries to hold down the famous white pleated dress. It billows up like a paratrooper's parachute, like those parachutes she sprayed and inspected so long ago at the radio plane factory, just before she started modeling. Back when World War II was still raging, the concentration camps about to be discovered by the American and Russian GIs. Marilyn yawns, Marilyn smiles, Marilyn glows. Her skin is just like Billy Wilder described it decades ago, flesh that photographs like flesh. You feel you can reach out and touch it, hold it, squeeze it. For a moment, the film crew crowds in, and Jules shoots through a gap between their bodies. He captures only Marilyn's face, which looks off to the left, serious and unsmiling. DiMaggio is there in the crowd, though you can't see him. But Marilyn can, and she watches him walk away. Tom Ewell comes into the shot, and Marilyn pushes him into place. Billy Wilder, dressed in his winter coat and fedora, moves in and out of the shot. Marilyn's dress flutters as she holds it down and chats with Ewell, but it flutters up again and she laughs, throwing her head back. The dress flies clear up over her head, revealing the 2 pairs of white silky underpants and the patch that they have failed to camouflage. The skirt hovers behind her like angel's wings, and for a second, it looks like she might just fly up, up, and away, over the metropolis rooftops and the screaming, leering crowd that we cannot see or hear. Then as suddenly as she appeared, Marilyn is gone. The dream is over. 3 seconds of black is followed by a single frame from a home movie. A middle-aged Schulbach relative strolls on the green grass, a teenage boy behind her, both on a typical, miraculous family outing. A family that, had it not been for Harry or Faye or for America, would simply not exist.
Because your Opie loved life and showed up in the middle of the night to take that picture, we have this story. So, thanks, Opie.
Yeah.